Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. My name is Nate Leaky. I am the Adventures and Engagement Director for Tuleyome. Tuleyome works in the Northern Intercoast Range Mountains, specifically the Berreyssa Snow Mountain National Monument region. Think of like Lake Berreyssa, Stebbins Cold Canyon, like Vacaville area, all the way up through Snow Mountain Wilderness, beyond Clear Lake, up to like the Leaky Wilderness up in there. We focus on many different things, including preserving public access to public lands. It's our public lands. We want you to get out there and enjoy it. And we want to teach you about it, teach everybody about our public lands in the Berreyssa Snow Mountain National Monument region. One of the areas that we are focused on currently is a ridge line that is called Hyporheic, which is what is colloquially known. I don't know. Maybe I said that right. It's known as Walker Ridge right now. So it's up by Indian Valley Reservoir near Bear Valley, just north of Highway 20. We are looking to expand Berreyssa Snow Mountain National Monument to include those public lands on there because it's a very culturally important and ecosystem and diversity is very high up there. So we want to include that in Berreyssa Snow Mountain National Monument. But that's not why you're here today. You are here to hear from Dr. Stephen McCord, who is going to talk to you today, this evening, about water in the Northern Intercoast Range, or the Intercoast Range, maybe just the Coast Range. So Dr. McCord is got his PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering from UC Davis. He is the president of McCord Environmental. He has helped Tuleyome with various projects throughout the years, including mercury mine remediation and other water quality and erosion control projects, including a current one out at the Knoxville OHV area, just south of Clear Lake. And he has also recently joined the Tuleyome Board and is currently the vice president of the board. So we said, welcome to the board, help us. And he did. So I am going to say goodbye and turn it over to Dr. McCord. It's over to you, Stephen.
All right, great, thanks. I'll put this in presentation mode. Or sure, I have some slides to share that'll kind of guide my discussion and what I can share with you. Give me just a second. All right, is it showing the speaker view?
No, we see your slideshow again. Or we see all your notes. So you gotta switch there it is.
Okay. All good.
Yes, that looks good.
Okay, great. We tested that just before we started and it was right, and then it goes reverts. Anyway, so hi everybody. As the names were showing up there, I recognize several names, so it's great to see some familiar ones and some new ones too. I've been living in this area since 1993 most of the time, and I just love figuring out how water moves around and landscape, and it's coming useful for various projects and then just a general interest. And I presume some of you share that same kind of interest because you're listening to this talk. So I look forward to some discussion afterwards. We got about an hour, and I'll share for about 30, 40 minutes, and then time for questions and answers and things like that afterwards, and some discussion. So please feel free to take notes. You can put things in the chat, and look forward to tracking those at the end. So I'll start from the broad picture and narrow down, and then also go from upstream to downstream, as in the theme of following the raindrops. So first, just so everybody's on the same page, so to speak, or in the same watershed, this photo just gives you a broad sense of the hydrologic cycle. So basically, I consider myself a water quality engineer, and to understand the quality of the water at any place, you need to know where that water came from and what happened to it on its way from, from not the beginning per se, but I guess evaporating from the seas and falling on the landscape. So it helps to know where the water is moving and coming from and going to. In terms of the quality, that's my primary interest. So this shows the hydrologic cycle, and you can see water evaporates from the land and the oceans primarily, and then falls as precipitates on the landscape and has various ways of making its way back downstream, back to the oceans or other sinks. But the key message with this is that it's a cycle. Water is not created or destroyed, it's just moving around on the landscape. And also, I tend to work with freshwaters and watersheds and surface waters. And this photo is really telling. If you sucked all the water together and put it on Earth, that's what it would look like for comparison. That's all of the water. Most all of that is seawater. So just a small fraction of that bubble there or globule of water is the fresh water on the landscape. And then you drill down to some little area and it's that much smaller, but it all comes together. There's people everywhere having influence on it. There's global emissions and all that. So it's definitely a think globally, act locally sort of message with water. Now, drilling down a little bit to California, this is a nice graphic from that I got from some friends at Department of Water Resources a few years ago. The one on the left shows precipitation, the sort of underlying colors, the blue and the red and the bottom, sort of, I don't know what color that is, pinkish, reddish, orangish. The fundamental message that it rains in the north, especially on the coast, and it's dry in the south. And where the people are, like each one of those dots is like 1 million people or something. So there's nearly 40 million people in California. You can see where most of them are. They're not in those wet spots so much. So it's a matter of getting the water from where it is to where it needs to be, where people are in agriculture and that sort of thing for a lot of the water. And the total annual runoff, you can see on the right graphic there, the MAF is millions of acre feet, and an acre is roughly like a football or soccer field, and a foot's a foot deep. So 1 million of those would mean 1 million football fields a foot deep of water, and 50 or 55 million or 56 million of them, and that's sort of average. Whereas in the southern, almost 2/3 of the state, there's much less. So it's moving water at the broad scale is something that happens. And one way that happens is these major water projects. There's two fundamental ones, the state water project and the federal Central Valley project. The federal one, I think that one happened first mostly, and it served just the Central Valley, and the state one got statewide support by going even further. So you can see the red lines coming from the Delta, which is near us, all the way down to LA and linking into the San Diego system too. And then you can see the text in the upper left are local projects. That's just in that area. So the Cache and Poudre Creek watersheds and even north of there are not participants, so to speak, in that in that huge these two huge projects of replumbing California's water. Drilling down a little bit more, this is a map of you can see in red the sort of narrow band in the kind of in the middle running north to south is the Berreyssa Snow Mountain National Monument boundary. And then the 5 counties are the broader outlines. You can see the terms for Calusa Lake, Napa, Solano, that sort of thing. And the purpose of this map was for the 2 watersheds of Cache and Poudre Creek. So Cache Creek watershed is in the aquash green in the top, or the upper part, and the lower one, more orange, is Poudre Creek, which is a fascinating watershed, or both of those are. One of the really interesting things about both of them is how they're big and wide at the top, and they're very, very narrow once it hits the valley, where above and below the Yolo County words. Especially Poudre Creek, water flows away just on the landscape from the creeks, not towards it. Just kind of interesting movement of water there. Another part of it another piece of the story. This is a graphic just in the valley. So the area, sort of the oval in red, is the Davis Woodland sort of area, and you can see some levees there. You go north of there into Colusa County. There's just the levees in the it's part of the flood control levees that just along the Sacramento River. But there's in sort of the valley wide, there's over 2,000 miles of levees. So that really changes the movement of water at that broad scale from where it would naturally go and flood and that sort of thing. So it's another part of the story at the tail end. Another one related to this, and then I'm gonna move back upstream, I promise. But the yellow bypass hydrology is really fascinating too. I was just driving over it today, and they're trying to expand the causeway. These arrows, the direction of the arrow shows the movement of water when everything is flooding, and the size of the arrow is the amount of water that can pass at any point at any amount of time. So you can see the yellow bypass, the lowest huge arrow, that can carry an enormous volume of water, versus to the right is the Sacramento River. So as the American and Sacramento join, they need this bypass so lower Sacramento doesn't flood like it used to historically. So that's all part of the system. And another piece of this related to the Coast Range is look at the small arrows on the left side going into that. You can see the Colusa Drain, Ridgecut, Cache Creek, Willow Slough Bypass, and Poudre Creek. Those are relatively small contributions to the whole valley, which includes, you know, all of the Sierras and up around Shasta and all that. But still interesting. Another broad context thing that I want to mention early on with this is the variety of stakeholders who care about water. They have a stake in the water resources and the movement of water. So it's land managers who sometimes need water. There's water managers who are buying and selling water, and at various districts, from federal and state, like the big projects, and then a lot of regional and local projects too, and water districts and irrigation districts and levee districts and others. And then there's the regulators at all those same scales that make sure everybody does it according to code and laws and all. And municipalities, different levels also, taxpayers, landowners, and all kinds of other interested people, researchers, consultants, et cetera. So a lot of people are interested in water, and you're some of them here. Okay, now starting back upstream, the upper watershed, and then I'll talk about this part and then move downstream from there. So springs, mines, and more. The first thing to point out is there are a lot of mineral springs on the landscape. So when the rain falls on the landscape, and sometimes snow, some of it infiltrates and it doesn't disappear, right? It sometimes comes out through these leaky holes in the landscape. The graphic on the right is from a national database, and every one of those dots is an identified spring. And you can see in the legend there, boiling hot, warm. So they know roughly the temperature of it. The temperature of the water coming out depends on what it was subjected to, like how deep it went, how hot the subterranean geology is. And for example, on the left side are two photos. The one on the upper left, well, I took both of these, but there's a guy I was working with. We were trying to sample some springs, and that was one. You know, it's just a moist green part of the otherwise dry landscape, how you can find it. And otherwise, it just looks like normal water. And that one was you know, ambient temperature and not crazy salinity. And then on the bottom is near Wilbur Hot Springs in a dry season a few years ago. Really milky, coming out at a higher concentration, and the chalky residue on the left is from the high salt content. The water dissolves and leaves that behind. So you can get some really fascinating things. That milky stuff, by the way, was some bacteria. I never got it identified, but pretty fascinating stuff. It was almost gelatinous, not just you know, milky water. Fascinating. Anyway, that's mineral springs and what they do on the land. Another thing that moves water at the sort of local scale all over the place is mines. There's a rich history of particularly mercury mining, but others, gold mining. in the coast range, and they have an impact on the local hydrology. It's a preferential path for water to come out or to go in, depending on the orientation and all that. So it's important to know those. And a lot of the mines exploited veins that were where mineral springs came out and precipitated some mineral of interest. And so they would mine those places. And so it often co-located the mines with the mineral springs. But you can see how many there are. The dots aren't size like bigger mines and smaller mines, but there are some big ones in there. And that shows the same sort of counties. And the black outlines are the same two watersheds, the Cass Creek and the Poudre Creek. I'll tend to focus on those from the work that I've done. And then drilling down to a particular mine site. This is one that I did with Tuleyome, started over a decade ago. Corona and Twin Peaks, those are two mines right beside each other. They're mercury mines. And on the left, the photo there is a mine shaft. So the miners went in, they had a little rail cart sort of system, blasted away and pulled the material they didn't want out and wasted that. And then they found, good enough, rich enough mercury-rich ore to mine it. But the problem is, so they put the hole in there, water starts coming out and leaking in and started flowing out. So the photo on the right was well below that, like a couple hundred feet below it. They dug a tunnel in there to drain it. They dug a tunnel roughly horizontally, and then shafts going up to the one on the left. And that would drain it, and it would come out by the creek. So the water that you see there, the sort of residue that was orange, part of the project was to treat that so it didn't drain into the creek looking like that. And this is the project, the same project. We were controlling the erodible soils there on this hill slope. All the green stuff was hydro-seeded. And then this is another area, a guy, Vic Clausen from UC Davis, sort of helped design this, where the white bags are lime to adjust the pH, and then the logs you see there were to stabilize the steep hill slope against erosion and landslides and all. And then we revegetated it so it hold it in place and increase infiltration and that sort of thing. And then the same adit that I showed, or the mine shaft, as colloquially said, this is the water coming out of that before we did much with it. So the landowner or the land manager had done some work to cause the water to infiltrate, but it was flooding over, as you can see there. So we built this sort of system here that took that water and in a controlled environment, this sort of bin on the right, it would precipitate out, and then they could collect it and put it in a repository. So the orange is just are primarily iron oxide. So basically rust, as water can do. So it leached it out. The rainfall seeped into the ground, leached out the iron and other minerals, and then it got into out into the surface here and the open air and oxidized and formed that rust coating. Pretty fascinating. And then another piece of the project, this is just a graphic, it's a little hard to get it, but we drilled a hole, and here's what the drill looked like. So that was a directional drill. We drilled a hole and then injected some chemicals to encourage the biological activity that would coat the ore body and prevent that orange iron-rich water from coming out. Not just iron, but nickel and other things too. So anyway, there's a nice little treatment system that dealt with the hydrology at a local scale in several different ways. Another important thing to recognize, and this is something you can think about when you're next off in the hills. There's some fascinating examples of this. This is just a somewhat random photo I took. I think this is in Stebbins. I think it's Stebbins Cold Canyon Preserve up on the ridgeline. And there are three things to point out here that are labeled. First, in the foreground is the fire scars. That's what happens on the landscape, and then it's all bare for a while until it revegetates, which then the rain that falls runs off a lot faster because it's not slowed down by vegetation. And then the two faces and the difference in the distance here, the east face and the south face, there's some shadow effects here, but even aside from that, you can tell the east faced and the north faces, which you don't see too well in this photo, are more vegetated because they're less directly exposed to the sun compared to the south face or the west faces, like the southern exposure. So on the southern faces and all around the coast range, you tend to get just grasses and really light scattering of brushes. And on the other side, you get thicker layers of brush and even some trees, just from the topography and orientation. So that all has an impact on the landscape. And when the land is more barren, you tend to get more erosion, which is an important thing in this region. So the map on the right shows some of that, where you have the purplish colors. You can see the legend in the middle, the tons per acre year. So every year you get this sort of tons from 1 acre eroding from the landscape. So in the valley, it's not that much. It's even accreting or adding on in some places rather than eroding. But then you see in the upper parts of the watershed, around the watershed boundaries, so those are the mountaintops in Napa County and a little bit in Lake, there's a lot of erosion, 150, 200 tons per acre year after year. So where does that stuff go? It washes downstream, and it's all caused by the hydrology and the topography. And then, so a couple of things about lakes and floodplains to recognize, because that's when the water leaves those high areas and runs downstream. So there's both good news and bad news about them, with flood control, water storage, hydropower, recreation. Probably those wouldn't come to mind when I wrote this. And then some negative ones or difficult challenges is that it traps sediment and it blocks migration. In this area, there were salmon runs, at least some years, and they can't get past the dam. Actually, that's a joke I should share with you. 2 fish swim into a concrete wall. One turns the other, and what's he say? Dam. See the dam. Anyway, so the graphic here is showing that basically you have a turbid inflow, put in a dam, it fills up in a reservoir, and you got clean water coming out. That sediment has to go somewhere, so it accumulates in the bottom of the reservoir. So every mountain meadow that you've seen pretty much is a former lake bed that just filled in over time. And the same thing will happen to every reservoir on Earth, because there's always going to be more sediment coming in than going out. So it fills up. It's got to go somewhere, right? It's just a matter of time. Some go hundreds of years, but others go merely decades. But there you go. So that's an interesting part about following the raindrops. And then, so that's the upper watershed. Water rushes down off the hillsides, carries sediment, and it hits some of these reservoirs. The reservoirs store water, but then there's the matter of getting it to where it's going to be used by people. And this is a graphic, both of these from that wonderful acronym, Yolo County Flood Control and Water Conservation District. As a former employee, Max Stevenson, said, our name is long, but our mission is strong. And even a long acronym. Anyway, the graphic and the map in the upper right is the watershed. And what you can see in there is the sort of service, where the water comes from in the bluer part. And then I may have misplaced that thing now that I think about it. I think where the blue lines are coming off, I think it's a little bit too high. But anyway, the point is they take water from the upper watershed and they distribute it into the yellow area. So that's the service area that water gets diverted from the creek for use in our local agricultural economy. And you can see in the photo on the bottom left, that's the diversion dam on Cache Creek. And water goes off to the right. You can see the canal there, which is to the north. And then there's another one to the south on the left side. So they back up the water there, which is just enough to shunt it off to the sides. And then it just, it slowly loses the elevation and supplies the farm fields all around. Another interesting thing about this, it'll come up a little bit later too, is most of those canals, not the beginning of the one on the right there, but most other parts of it are not lined. They're not concrete or anything like that. It's just dirt. So the water running over dirt, what happens? Well, some of it seeps into the ground. And this is here's a term to impress your friends, hyporheic. hyporheic flows are the sort of the water that's moving around, not in the surface of a creek or a canal or something, but in the ground. So it's moving back and forth, and it's moving or in and out from the groundwater outside of the active channel, and then it's moving downstream too, like through the cobbles and things. So that term hyporheic flow is important for river ecology and things like that. So recognize when you look at a body of water flowing past, most of the water is flowing past, just like you see, but some is evaporating and sometimes it's precipitating on. And then there's all these other interactions below too. And it's an important aspect of the groundwater and surface water hydrology. This is a typical canal in the valley in Yolo County. As you can see, it's elevated a little bit. So for the farmer to get it, they just open a gate. They don't have to pump it up. It's just enough above the land. You can just run it through open canal. So it's a very low energy sort of system there. And then this photo is pretty fascinating area. This is right after that diversion dam. There's an area outside of Cape, just below Cape Valley and Dunnigan, all that, where there's a lot of gravel mining. And what you can see in here laced along the creek or all around the creek is just gravel beds. And then these water bodies, this one's kind of very light colored, chalky. And there's another over here that's a lot darker. And up here, there are more in other stretches. I just sort of zoomed in on this one. But you get a lot of this hyporheic flow, say use that term, in this area. The water slows down because it's in the valley. It doesn't have the steepness that it did where people go rafting and whatnot. It's just slow moving and dries out and the water seeps into the ground. But some of the water, the water in these mines, or the former gravel mines, they're just holes in the ground. They filled in with groundwater. So there you get this recharge or whatever coming in those, and then the water evaporates. So it's an interesting dynamic of the water here where you lose some, because of the mining, you've got surface water and it enhances the evaporative loss in this area. But it's a complicated system to model and understand. This one is downstream. So the farmers in the valley, many of the farmers use that surface water supplied by the county. But in the dry years, there's not enough water coming down those, like in the last drought. So they stick a straw down below and they pump it out. So the photo on the left is a typical agricultural pump. It just pulls the water from there and it discharges it on land, and then it's just sent by canals into the fields in different ways, depending on the crops and whatnot. So the map on the right is all of the wells in the Yolo. Yeah, this is a Yolo and Solano County in the valley. That's a lot of dots, right? And this is all basically the same drink with all these straws in it. You know, I mean, it doesn't move around too much up and down, but I mean, you know, north and south, but certainly there's an influence from all these wells. So it's really important to manage it. And there's a program that's been doing that for about a decade now. But it's a key thing. The water's coming in. You got this hyporheic flow. It's the third time I've used it, that distributes water in and out. And these wells, the ones that are beside the creek. Now take a look here. You can see I hope my cursor, my mouse, Lake Berreyssa and Lower Poudre Creek. Notice there's a higher density of wells along the creek. So those wells are definitely taking some of that creek water and, you know, pulling it out below the ground. So there's interesting interactions there. And then in the urban areas, there's a similar sort of thing going on. So this is the Davis Woodland, maybe I've gotten the name wrong, the water supply project. So this is a fairly new intake off the Sacramento River, just off of I-5. You can see a beautiful building there in the intake. And there's a pipe and a treatment water treatment facility here. So for potable water, they take river water and they treat it for drinking water. Woodland does something extra that goes into their service area, and when they can get water but they don't need it, they pump it into the ground, and then in the dry season they take it back out. So they don't need big storage tanks. They got the ground below the city, so they track all that, the amount of water coming in, what it coming out, and all this, and the quality of it, because it changes once you put it in the ground. Whereas Davis doesn't do that so much. Davis sends down here, and Davis has, I don't know, a dozen active wells or something like that. There's probably 30 that have been used over time. But there's a bunch of, I think it's at 9 active wells in Davis. So Davis doesn't pump the water in, they just use it or don't use it. And so sometimes they have surface water, and sometimes there's not enough, so they pump from the ground and supplement it. So both of them are sort of conjunctive use. That's an efficient way of using the water available throughout the year. Another interesting thing is in these urban areas, in the US, so the graphic on the right shows sort of a cross-section of a typical community where you have sewer pipes and storm drains. In the East, there's just one set of pipes. And also in downtown Sacramento and parts of San Francisco, they have just one pipe system. It's really common there for whatever reason, but in the West and in Davis and Woodland and other communities around here, there's separate systems. And there's pros and cons of both of them, but you get a sense of what happens. The sewer lines go to treatment plants and then off to the river, but the storm drains don't. So when your dog poops on the street and it washes into the drain, or you wash your car and it goes down the drain, that goes straight to the waterways. So it's a common source of pollution in urban areas in the West, where it goes straight to the creeks or wetlands or whatever. I'm gonna pass that one. Okay, that's most of what I wanted to share about the watershed and the movement of water on it. And I figured I'd share a couple other things, and then we can chat. One is there's a nice website, sacriver.org, you could check out, and it shows the watershed, the Sacramento River watershed here, and our area, the Intercoast Range, is on the left side here. And you go to the map and click on any one of them, it'll bring up a separate page and tell you more about it. So I contributed to this effort, so I'm kind of proud of it. And you can see down the lower part here, there's Poudre Creek and sort of red, and Cache Creek there. So you click on either one of those, and then above that, can't remember that one. There's other watersheds just on the west side, so you can check those out as well. And then some really good reading material about this that I've read over the last 30 years. These two on the left, the Great Thirst and Cadillac Desert, are broad. They're sort of Western water. And then Battling the Inland Sea is about the Central Valley water projects, mostly the Sacramento Valley. This is a photo from like Yuba City, Marysville, something like that, when it flooded, which happens still. And the Central Valley used to look like an inland sea when it would flood, because we didn't have the same flood control structures we have now. And then after the gold rush is a fascinating story about the Davis Winters area, mostly along Poudre Creek, but a little bit of woodland too to the north, and just the resiliency of the people that lived there, mostly before, like into the early 1900s, before the major flood control works, and how their resiliency in responding to the floods that would look like battling the inland sea, and then they bounce back with a bumper crop, and it was quite the boom and bust, just like the gold rush. So anyway, some interesting stuff there. And then if you want more information or any other questions or things to share, I'd be happy to talk to you about it later, or send me an email or give me a call or whatever. There's my contact information.
My name is Jeff Ben. I'm the Education Associate with Tuleyome. All right, well, thank you, Dr. McCord, for an excellent talk and excellent Q&A session. If you enjoyed the talk, just a reminder that this is a monthly lecture series. So our next Nature and You lecture is going to be in August on Thursday, the 24th. That's going to be with Brianna Martinico from UC Cooperative Extension. And she's going to be talking about the beneficial role that birds can play, wild birds can play in agriculture in our area. So if you're interested in that, you can go to tuleyome.org. Click on the events page and sign up for that lecture. We also have our schedule of hikes and trail building activities up there for the fall. So check that out if you are interested. Thank you all for coming out, and I hope to see you again at a future Nature and You lecture series.
Thanks, Jeff. And thanks everybody for the questions and interest.